In that earlier vid to a skeptic, we referred to a sort of postmodern despair that is accepted by some textual critics, one that leads them to claim that we can't be certain of the textual transmission of any ancient document, no matter how much evidence we have. There's not much we can say about that sort of despair, since it's the sort of thing that's rooted in paranoia or mistrust rather than actual evidence. The one thing we can say is that those who say we can never know what the original text of a document looked like are essentially self-refuting. That's because in order to say with authority that we can never know what the original text looked like, then we also cannot know enough to say that we do not know. In other words, the claim of uncertainty itself presupposes an objective, full-formed grasp of the data, one that the despairing textual critic claims everyone else lacks. And as I also noted, if these despairing sorts really believe what they say, I expect them to throw out the works of all these other ancient writers, and then admit that they have no basis at all upon which to reconstruct history. Pretty desperate step, but I've seen one or two do it in my time. What about other despair theories, one that aim for claims of high uncertainty even if not absolute? There are some, but to begin we'll need to go over some more of that dull stuff a lot of you know already. Sometimes you'll see critics talk about variants in the Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. That is, differences in content from other manuscripts. And usually you'll see them throw around a large number like this one. That number can seem pretty imposing, at least until we break it down. The variants can be broken down into 4 basic types or categories. The first category is what we might call obvious typos or spelling issues. Something like this would be, where it's pretty clear what a copyist of a manuscript got wrong and how we'd fix it. That accounts for about 70% of the variants, which means that big number just got a lot smaller. The next category we can broadly describe in terms of the use of synonyms, or in transpositions of words, or similar phenomena. In other words, one manuscript might say, "he stood on the shore," while another might say, "Peter stood on the shore," and it's clear from the context that the "he" is Peter. Simple stuff and not a problem to figure out. That accounts for another 20% of that large number. The third category involves variants that do affect the meaning of the text, but are cases where the evidence is so clear that we don't have any problem figuring out the original reading. A good example is in 1 Thessalonians 2:9, which refers to the gospel of God. There's an alternate reading that says the gospel of Christ, but that alternate reading appears in only one manuscript out of those 5,700, and that one is from medieval times. So it's too late to seriously think that it could have been what Paul wrote. But either way, that sort of thing chops out another 9% of that number. So what's that leave us? Yep, just 1%. And that's a variance for which we have no solution in terms of what the original said. A good example is in 1 Thessalonians 2:7, where Paul either describes himself and his friends as gentle or as little children. The difference between the two options in Greek is one letter, and the weight of the evidence is behind neither version. Either one could make sense in the context, so we're stuck, sort of. I mean, think about it. Does either reading change anything important? Not really. And that's why you often hear Christian apologists say that there's not a single variant reading where Christian doctrine is at stake. Yes?
Yeah, look, I got 2 big problems here. First, I can find plenty of variants where Christian doctrine is at stake.
Okay, we can discuss those in the next vid. What's your other problem?
The other problem is there's some great arguments for undetected corruptions happening in the time from before we have New Testament manuscripts. We don't have any whole manuscripts dating earlier than the 3rd century. That's over 200 years those stupid Christians had to mess with them.
And your evidence that they did mess with them is what?
Evidence? I don't need no evidence. I've got paranoid suspicion.
Yeah, you don't know how often that's the real argument, all right. Now, to be fair, I've seen a few more reasonable attempts to argue for unknown changes from the time before we have textual evidence. One argument has been that because the earliest manuscripts we do have show the highest rate of variance, this must mean that the production of variants was even greater from the earlier period from which we have no manuscripts. Well, there's a few problems with that. For one thing, it's basically guilt by association, using the copying habits of 3rd and 4th century copyists to extrapolate concerning the behavior of entirely different people living 100 to 200 years earlier. For another, it ignores the fact that at the early stages of the 1st and 2nd century, the original writings of the apostles would still be available as a control which scribes could check. But finally, this argument ends up self-refuting by its own methods. If we're permitted to extrapolate backwards based on later scribal behaviors, we have to do so completely. And if we do that, we can also extrapolate those percentages we looked at earlier, which means this number might increase to something like this. And it also means we still don't have any reason to suppose that there was any textual change that affected Christian doctrine, since the number we now have is 0. Extrapolate that backwards and we still have 0. Doesn't do the critics a lot of good, does it? That concludes our look at some major forms of the gloom and despair argument. Next up, we'll start looking at some claims of problematic variance, and eventually we'll be bringing back this guy. Yep, we told you he'd be back. See ya.